I have it not to be edited. Here's the link to it. And if you guys remember, this was really just a random sample of, I believe it was 21 individuals in our data set. And why did I do a random sample? Just to kind of allow us to have a small data set that is a little bit easier to visually see, so that, you know, it's a little easier to follow than looking at the entire data set, you know, unto itself. Okay, so here is one particular bar chart that I did in, once again, my morning class. And let me just quickly explain what it is. I am looking at our love of stats variable. And if you guys remember, the love of stats variable was basically me asking you before you took this class, do you love statistics? And for the responses for the 21 students in this random sample, what we had was 14 of you said no, and 7 of you said yes. Okay, so when we look at that, this is our little bar chart. We see definitely more no's than yeses. And then when we break it down using percentages, you know, we're getting about roughly 2/3 of the class saying that they don't love stats, and 1/3 of the class saying that they do. Okay, and I'll tell you that historically, the third of the class that getting 1/3 of the class loving stats before the class starts is actually a pretty high percentage. Usually it's like somewhere down below like 20% or so. Okay, so great. So we described students' love of stats, okay? But as we were going through our research questions, often we had research questions where we weren't just interested in the results of one particular question. One particular question. Or sorry, one particular output. Our results really depended not just on one particular variable, but rather 2 of them. For example, you guys looked at, do female students have higher GPAs than male students? Well, that in and to itself cannot just be answered by looking at just GPAs. You need to have both GPAs and gender for that sort of comparison. You guys also answered questions like, do athletes get more, or are athletes more likely to get advising than non-athletes? So once again, to answer this question, we really needed to look at the results, or we really needed to summarize the results, not just on whether or not they get advising, but we also needed to know, are you an athlete or are you not an athlete? So the question that I'm going to look at here is, okay, so we know we have a certain distribution of stats lovers in the class, okay? And you know, Julia compared it to calculus. I don't know. You ask 18-year-old, or no, so 20-year-old David, calculus would totally whoop stats. It's only as I've grown older that I've grown much more appreciative of stats, just being ultimately super powerful for everyday life. But once again, I'm looking at this love of stats, and kind of one question that I have, because I'm a teacher, you know, so I teach this class. I also teach our Path to Stats course. And if you look at our Path to Stats course, that's called Math 190. And you know, one of the things that I kind of wonder is, does taking Math 190, does that influence how students feel about stats? Namely, does it seem like students who take Math 190 kind of like stats more than students who don't? And so in order to do this kind of comparison, I really need to be able to see, or have a way of summarizing both our students' love of stats and whether or not they take Math 190. And the way that we are going to do this is by basically constructing what we call a two-way table, or a contingency table. And really what we're going to try to do is, we're going to take this love of stats here, we're going to take this love of stats that we see, And we're going to start breaking up all those no's and yeses. We're going to break them up by whether or not they took Math 190, okay? And so we're going to ultimately get a table that's going to allow us to look at both all at one time, okay? So that's what I'm going to do right now. So I'm going to create a pivot table that's going to allow me to look at both this love of stats and this Math 190 variable kind of all at once, okay? And so here's how it's going to go. So I am going to, just like we did earlier, okay, remember how when we went to go summarize, we actually highlighted the entirety of the data set, and that's what I'm going to do also. Okay, I'm going to go from the top corner up here, and I'm going to go all the way to the bottom corner down here, but holding shift, that's probably the easiest way to select the entirety of the data set. And I'm going to go ahead and, like, every time I need to summarize by categorical variables, I'm going to go and insert a pivot table. I'm going to put it down here where it's not in the way. Okay. Oops. Sometimes you have to actually click on this before you select a cell. Okay. And now I have this pivot table editor that I had before. So if you guys remember before, we just went to rows, okay? And we went add, okay? And we selected a variable that we were interested in. So I'm gonna keep the same thing for the love of stats right there, okay? So this right here is loving stats, okay? But now what I'm going to do is I am also going to break down those love of stats into columns, okay? And what that's going to do is I'm going to start looking at this other variable. So if you guys remember, I'm more interested in Math 190, okay? And now what we've done is we've created kind of this four-way, well, it's a two-way table, but it has four different options. So if you think about it as an individual, you know, either you did not take Math 190 or you did. Either you don't love stats or you do. And basically what we have here in these four little boxes here, these four little responses, okay? And there's actually one blank, and that's partially because one student didn't respond. So that's why there's the blank right there. And what you guys are seeing right here is basically a no and a yes that are really contingent on, oh, sorry. What you're seeing right here is basically all the possible combinations of taking Math 190 and loving stats. So here we're going to be placing all the people who did not take Math 190 and still don't like stats. We're going to take people who did not take Math 190 and do love stats. We're going to take the people who did take Math 190 and don't love stats. And the same thing down here with the taking Math 190 and loving stats. Okay, so that's setting up this table. So I have one variable as the rows, one variable as the columns. And then I'm gonna, for values, here's where I'm just gonna pick one of the two. It actually doesn't end up mattering. I think you guys will see. Okay. If I pick 190 right there, I get kind of a slightly different value. Okay. So there we got that right there. Okay. And now here is basically a two-way table. Okay, everybody. I'm sorry, let me go here to, let me choose the, oh, I'm sorry. Math 190. And then down here for values, let me go ahead and do the love stats. Yeah, looks exactly the same. Okay. All right, cool. All right, so we have all this two-way table right here. Now let's look at these numbers here, and I just want to kind of read each of them and kind of show you how it corresponds to kind of what we have up here. Oh yeah, Julia, no, you do not have to take Math 190. It's like an entirely separate thing. So once again, looking at everybody's responses, do you guys see how these people were no's, no, 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 and so on and so forth? Well, what we have right down here is a count. There were 10 individuals who did not take 190 and don't love stats. We have 4 individuals who did take 190 and don't love stats. And we have a column, we have a row total right here at the end where that's just basically remember, our 14 people who did not love stats. Okay. Now over here, what we have is 7 people total. Remember, those are the people who do love stats. And those people are broken down, okay, into 6 people who did not take 190 and 1 person who declined to answer. And that's what you see right here. And basically nobody who did take who do love stats and did take the 190. Oh, that kind of hurts. Uh, and then we have some totals at the bottom right here. Now what the totals here at the bottom are breaking down how many people took who didn't take 190 in the samples. That's 16. Here are the 4 people who did take 190 in my sample. And then finally, we had the 1 person who decided not to respond, okay, who just decided to be blank. And then the 21 here is that grand total, okay? All right, cool. So that's what we call a contingency table or a two-way table. And the way we create it is just basically by picking one variable to stand in for the rows and then picking another variable to stand in for the columns. Now, the next question becomes, well, okay, so how do we visualize what we just did? And the way we're going to visualize what we just did was by creating this thing that we call a comparative bar chart. And a comparative bar chart, we're going to create almost exactly the same as we did for the other one. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to select everything that isn't a grand total. So if you guys remember, that was a big part of what we did. We wanted to omit the grand total. And then I'm going to go ahead and go to Insert Chart. And I am going to, okay, take this over here. And to kind of point out what we have right here, I don't have a title. I have all that kind of stuff, the stuff I have to add, okay? We see some no's, we see some yeses, and then we see like a legend with different colors, okay? Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and go to Customize over here. And let me double click that right there. And what I want to show is I want to actually put in the data labels just so you guys can actually see the right particular count. Okay, so that's the no, that's the yes. Put the data labels there, and then that. Okay. You won't often put the data labels, but I just want to kind of point out what each of these numbers represents. So looking at this right here, okay, so notice how we have 10 and we have 4. That's a no and that's a yes. So what this is corresponding to, okay, is basically the 14 people in our survey who said they don't love stats, okay? So down here, this axes down here, and I need to put this as my label, but what we're looking at here are people who don't love stats, and then we are breaking down those people who don't love stats by whether or not they took 190. So we have 10 people who took 190. We have 4 people who did not. Okay. Now over here, we're taking the people who do love stats. Okay. And if you guys remember, those were broken down, okay, by one person who did take math 190, or no, one person who didn't respond, and 6 people who did not take math 190. Okay. So essentially what we're doing with a comparative bar chart is we're taking the old bar chart that we had before and taking that big bar right there, that one that was 14, and then now dividing them up by the second variable in a way that will allow us to compare. So just looking at it really quickly, I see that of the people who don't like stats, well, I have a lot more people who did not take 190 in that group, and a fewer number who did. Here, for the people who do love stats, I have basically nobody who took 190 and almost everybody who didn't. Okay. Now, when I make these charts, one of the problems with this chart right here is that how I divide up my data is going to change the chart. Okay, and what I mean by that is, let me go ahead and remove these bottom ones down here. I could decide to take this pivot table. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and take that pivot table. I'm going to copy it down here. Okay, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip the rows and the columns. Okay. Put Math 190 as the rows, and I'm going to put the love of stats as the columns. Okay, so the first thing I want to point out is that the numbers in our table aren't technically any different. All the counts are like nearly exactly the same. They are just kind of flipped over on their side, right? So instead of having these three numbers at the bottom, they're now over on the right side. Instead of having the totals 14 and 7 along there, they're now along the bottom. So it's not that the table is fundamentally different. It's not that the table is fundamentally different, but the graph that I create is going to kind of fundamentally tell us something different about our comparison. So I want you to look over here. Do you see how that looks very different from the other one? Well, that is partially because what we're really looking at here now is the responses to taking Math 190, and then we're visually comparing their love of stats within those groups. Okay, so these are people who didn't respond to the Math 190, right? That's basically what we had. And then here are the people who did not take Math 190. This many people. Oh, sorry, I just did what I told you guys not to do. You never highlight the grand total. So let me go back and there you go. That's a little bit better. Okay. So here we have the no responses. Here we have people who did not take Math 190, but now broken down by whether or not they love stats. And once again, these are the people who did take 190, broken down by whether or not they love stats. So I want you to see how different those two variables are, those two graphs look. Okay. Now the question is, and I want to have you play around with these a little bit before we answer this question. But the main question is, when we do this two-way table and we do these comparative bar charts, if our question is, does taking Math 190 influence whether or not you love stats? The question then becomes, which one of these two graphs is going to help us better answer that question?